Picture a city of 800,000 souls packed into a space barely 7 miles across. Now fill it with no running water, no sewers, no garbage collection, and the combined bodily output of every single one of those 800,000 souls landing somewhere. On the street, in the ditch, in the courtyard, in the bucket that gets emptied out the window, at whatever hour the person holding it decides they've had enough. Add the horses. Paris in 1750 has approximately 30,000 horses, each one producing roughly 20 pounds of manure per day. Do that math if you want. I did it so you don't have to. It's a lot of manure, a truly staggering amount of manure. Add the slaughterhouses along the northern edge of the city, where the blood runs in actual rivers down the street gutters, and the tanneries that soak hides in vats of dog urine, and the tripe sellers who boil offal in open pots that can be smelled from 3 streets away, and the 200,000 cesspits dug under buildings across the city, each one slowly leaking, slowly seeping, slowly releasing their contents into the soil and the wells, and eventually the Seine, which is also the river everyone drinks from. That's Paris, the most beautiful city in the world, the centre of European civilization, the place where philosophy happens, where art happens, where fashion happens, where Voltaire writes his letters and the king sleeps under silk sheets at Versailles, and the painters produce canvases that will hang in museums centuries from now, and someone will stand in front of them and say, quietly, "Oh, a place where you could drown in the intellectual brilliance of a salon argument in the afternoon and drown in actual sewage if you stepped wrong in the wrong alley at night." We're going there tonight, not as tourists, not as admirers standing back at a respectful distance, looking at the pretty buildings and the Seine in the golden light. We're living it, one man, one city, one life hidden inside the larger life of a world that does not have a word yet for what he is, but has plenty of words for what they'll do to him if they find out. So I make these history stories, and honestly, I have no idea if you're listening to fall asleep or if you're a particular kind of person who finds the intersection of 18th century French sanitation history and the secret social lives of men who loved men to be exactly the kind of thing that helps you drift off at night. Either way, no judgment whatsoever. Get comfortable. We're going to Paris. It smells terrible. It's also extraordinary. Here we go. The smell finds you before your eyes open. It finds you the way it always finds you, the way it found you yesterday and the day before that and every morning since you arrived in Paris 14 months ago, with a letter of introduction folded in your coat and exactly enough money to survive 1 week if you were careful. The smell is not one thing. It never is in Paris. It is a layered conversation between many terrible things, each one making its case, each one insisting on your attention. First, there is the smell from beneath the floorboards. Not the floorboards of your room specifically, though those have their own contribution, but the floorboards of the building at large, the whole 6-story structure on Rue de la Harpe, where you rent a space barely large enough to turn around in, on the 5th floor, up a staircase that lists slightly to the left, and squeaks on the 3rd step and the 7th step and the 14th. Beneath this building, as beneath most buildings in Paris, there is a cesspit. It was last emptied, you've been told, approximately 3 years ago. The vidangeurs came at night, as they always do, because emptying a cesspit is not something anyone wants to see happen in daylight. And they extracted what they could and took it out to the city's edges, and then 3 years of renewed deposits accumulated, and now the pit is full again, and the smell that rises through the floorboards at night is a warm, ammoniac, deeply biological presence that you've learned to sleep inside of the way a fish learns to breathe water. You notice it when you wake up. In an hour, you won't notice it at all. Second, from the window, which does not close properly and rattles when it's windy, there is the smell of the street. Rue de la Harpe runs north to south on the left bank, and its gutter runs down the centre of the road the way most Paris street gutters do, carrying whatever finds its way into it toward the Seine. Last night someone emptied a chamber pot from one of the upper windows into the street. You heard it. The familiar cry of Gare l'eau, which means something like watch out for the water, which is not water, and then the splashing impact. The sun has been up for perhaps an hour and it's already working on what hit the stones last night. Working on it in the way that August's sun works on organic matter, in an enclosed urban canyon with very little airflow. You know that smell too. Third, from the pallet on the floor 3 feet from your own, where Armand is still sleeping with his mouth open and one arm thrown over his eyes, there is the smell of another human body. Armand is 24, a typographer at the printing house on Rue Saint-Jacques, where you both work, and he has not bathed since sometime in May, which is 4 months ago, because it is now September of 1752. Neither of you. The basin in the corner of the room holds water you carry up 5 flights of stairs from the courtyard pump, and you use it to wash your face and your hands and the parts of yourself most likely to cause offence if left unwashed. But that is as far as it goes. A full bath, the kind where you submerge your entire body in hot water, costs money and requires either a bathhouse visit or a great deal of labour heating water over a fire, and the room you share with Armand does not have a fire, only a small iron stove that eats charcoal at a rate neither of you can consistently afford. You're warm enough. You're not clean. Nobody in Paris is really clean. Not the way you'd think of it later, if someone tried to explain clean to you in terms that referenced a world with pipes and pressure, and water arriving from the wall on command. Right now, clean is relative. Clean is the man on the street who managed to change his shirt this week. Clean is not having visible mud on your face. Clean is a standard you can meet most days if you try. You lie still for a moment and listen to the city coming alive outside the window. Paris wakes in layers. The market workers are already up, have been up since 3 in the morning, hauling carts to the Les Halles market in the centre of the city. The water carriers are already in the streets, the porteurs d'eau, with their wooden yoke frames and their 2 buckets, selling water by the bucket to people who haven't fetched their own. You can hear one of them below, on Rue de la Harpe, calling out in a voice roughened by years of calling out the same thing, allô, allô. It sounds like music. It is also the entire water infrastructure of one of the largest cities in the world, operating on human muscle and wooden buckets. The bells begin. Not 1 church, not 2. Every church in Paris rings its bells in the morning, and Paris has approximately 50 parishes within the old city walls, plus the great structures like Notre Dame and Saint-Sulpice and the Sainte-Chapelle, and then the convents and the monasteries, and when they all ring together you don't hear individual bells. You hear a city speaking in a language made entirely of bronze and air. The sound comes from every direction at once. It fills the room, fills your chest, vibrates in your back teeth. You've been in Paris 14 months and you still don't quite believe that sound. Your name is Jean-Baptiste Courbet. You are 23 years old. You came from Lyon a year and 2 months ago, carrying the letter of introduction from your father's old acquaintance, Maître Renaud, who runs the printing house on Rue Saint-Jacques, and who took you on as a compositor's apprentice despite the fact that you had almost no experience and arrived in a coat that was 3 years out of fashion. and immediately identifiable as provincial to every Parisian within 50 feet of you. Back in Lyon, everyone said Paris would make you. They were not wrong. It was already making you into something, though you weren't entirely sure what yet. You get up before Armand wakes, because you've learned that getting to the courtyard pump before the rest of the building's tenants is the difference between washing your face in relatively clear water and washing it in something that looks like it's been used already, which it has by the families on the lower floors who rise earlier. You pull on your breeches, your stockings, your shirt, which is damp along the collar because you hung it near the window overnight and the morning air is wet. You wrap your coat around yourself, though it's September and the morning chill hasn't set in properly yet, and you ease the door open without waking Armand. The staircase smells of everyone in the building concentrated. Every floor contributes. The family on the third floor with their 4 children contributes significantly. The old man on the second floor who's not been well contributes in ways you try not to think about. The ground floor, where the shoemaker operates during the day, smells of leather and the animal fat he uses to treat it, which is actually the most pleasant smell in the staircase, and you've started timing your descents to catch it before he opens for the morning. The courtyard is grey. The dawn light comes over the roof lines as a general brightening rather than a directed thing, the sun not yet high enough to reach down into the canyon of buildings. The pump is iron, mounted to the wall above a stone trough. You work the handle until the water comes, which takes longer than you'd like, and then you fill the basin you carry down and splash your face and the back of your neck and under your arms, working fast because the water is cold in a way that makes your teeth want to come together, and the sound might wake people. You run wet fingers through your hair, which needs cutting. You look at your reflection in the trough water and decide you look acceptable. This is the beginning of the day. You have been thinking about this for a long time, the fact of being what you are in the city you're in. There is no word for it in common French that is not also a crime. Sodomite. That is the word. It appears in legal documents, in police records, in sermons preached from the pulpits of those 50 parishes whose bells are still ringing. It appears as a category of offence in the statutes, punishable in theory by death, by burning, though in practice the courts of 1752 have become somewhat less enthusiastic about burning people than the courts of earlier centuries were, and the actual sentence for men caught with other men is usually the Bicêtre, or the Bastille, or a forced march to the galleys at Toulon. Usually, not always. You knew what you were before you came to Paris. You have known since you were perhaps 16, though you would not have been able to say it plainly then, not even to yourself. It was something you moved around carefully, like a piece of furniture in a dark room that you know is there and know would hurt if you walked into it directly. In Lyon there were no words and no places and no people, and so it remained the thing in the dark room, the furniture you walked carefully around. Paris is different. You didn't know it would be. You found out by accident, the way you find out most things in Paris. 3 weeks after you arrived, in the first week of August of the previous year, you were crossing the Tuileries garden in the late afternoon, taking the long way back from delivering a message to a bookseller on Rue de Rivoli. The garden runs along the north bank of the Seine west of the Louvre, all straight gravel paths and clipped hedges and fountains turned off for the season, because the city is saving water. The late sun made long shadows of the plane trees. There were people walking, there were always people walking, but something about the way some of the men walked, alone, pausing, looking at each other in a way that had nothing to do with where they were going. Something made the dark room in your chest crack open just slightly, just enough to let in a thread of light. You kept walking. You didn't stop. You didn't make eye contact with anyone. You walked straight through and out the other side and back to Rue de la Harpe, and went up the stairs and lay on your pallet and stared at the ceiling for a long time. But you had seen it. You understood that there was something happening there that was not random, that was not accidental, that the garden meant something in a language you didn't know yet but could learn. You spent the next week learning it, or beginning to, from a safe distance, from the edge of things where you could observe without being observed, or so you told yourself, though almost certainly the men you were watching knew exactly what you were doing, because they had all done it themselves at some earlier point. Learning the garden, learning what it meant. The Tuileries is one of several places in Paris that functions as what you will eventually understand is called a lieu de débauche, a place of debauchery, which is the term the police use. The men who come there use different terms, quieter ones, spoken in low voices. They call these places, when they call them anything at all, simply les lieux, the places. There are perhaps 8 or 10 significant ones in Paris, depending on the season and the mood of the police. The garden, certain sections of the Luxembourg gardens on the left bank, the arcades around the Palais Royal when it's open to foot traffic, several specific quais along the Seine at certain hours, a few bathhouses, some taverns with back rooms, the geography of a hidden city existing inside the visible one. You're standing in the courtyard with water drying cold on your face and thinking about none of this yet, because the bells are still ringing and Armand will be up in 20 minutes and you need to be at the printing house by 6, which means leaving by 5:30, which means leaving now. Rue de la Harpe in the September morning. The gutter running its slow brown course down the centre of the street. A dog nosing at something near the base of a wall. A woman with a basket on her arm moving quickly, head down, already into her day and past its beginning. You fall into stride and join the general movement of people going somewhere. The left bank in the morning smells of bread from the bakers who started their fires at midnight and are now pulling the first loaves. It smells of horse from the stables around the corner from your building. It smells of the river, always the river. The Seine carrying its load of everything downriver toward the sea, everything the city produces and discards and forgets. It smells of wood smoke and wet stone and the particular sharpness of Paris air in early September, when the summer stink is starting to ease just slightly, and autumn has not yet arrived with its own contributions. You walk through it all with your coat pulled close and your head slightly down, not looking at anyone directly, but watching everyone peripherally the way you've learned to do, the way everyone in Paris learns to do, because the city is too dense and too complicated and too full of people who want things from you to look at it straight on all the time. Peripheral vision is the skill of the city. You develop it, or you get taken advantage of constantly. The Rue Saint-Jacques runs from the Luxembourg on the south to the Ile de la Cité on the north, cutting through the left bank the way a spine cuts through a body. The printing house of Maître Renaud sits approximately 2/3 of the way up, between a bookbinder's establishment and a supplier of paper stock who smells, at this hour, of the sizing compound he uses to treat his sheets, a gelatinous animal smell that hits you every morning as you pass and which you have learned to breathe through your mouth for approximately 15 steps. The printing house door is already open. Light spills out from inside, the yellow weight of several oil lamps burning. You step through and into the world of ink and type and paper and the mechanical rhythm of presses being warmed up, cleaned, prepared for a day's work. Maître Renaud's printing house produces books. Not the fancy kind, not the kind with elaborate engravings and gilded spines, but the workmanlike kind. Legal documents, pamphlets, almanacs, devotional texts, the occasional scientific treatise. It is honest work. Renaud is an honest man, compact and methodical, with ink-stained fingers that he scrubs every night with a brush, and a particular soap he orders from a supplier in Marseille, and which he is extremely precise about not sharing. He has been printing for 30 years. He knows his trade the way old sailors know the sea, in his body, in his hands, without needing to think about it. "You're late," he says, without looking up from the compositing tray he's arranging. "You're not late." It is 3 minutes before 6. He says this every morning. You have learned to respond only by taking your place at the adjacent tray and beginning to work. The work of a compositor is to arrange individual metal-type letters into lines and lines into pages that will be locked into the press frame and inked and pressed against paper, over and over, producing copies. Each letter is a small raised block of lead alloy, kept in a case divided into compartments by frequency of use, and you pull them one by one and slot them into the compositing stick, left to right, reading everything backward because that's how type works, until a line is full and you start the next one. It requires concentration. It requires your fingers to know where the letters are without looking, because if you look at the stick, you lose your place in the copy you're setting. It is, after 14 months, a thing your hands do while your mind goes elsewhere. Your mind goes, this morning, to the bathhouses, specifically to the étuves, the public baths, of which Paris has perhaps 20 or 30, operating in various degrees of legitimacy and cleanliness. The word étuve originally meant a steam room, the kind the Romans used, and some of the older establishments still operate something close to that, with a room heated by coals and steam rising from water thrown on hot stones. But most of the Paris étuves in 1752 are simpler than that. A series of wooden tubs in partitioned rooms, with water heated in a copper boiler in the back and carried in buckets to fill the tubs, and an attendant who takes your money at the door and hands you a linen cloth to dry with. The cheapest ones cost 3 sous. A full immersion bath in a private tub in a private room costs more, perhaps 8 or 10 sous if the establishment is decent, 12 or 15 if it is particularly clean or particularly discreet. For a compositor's apprentice earning perhaps 50 sous a week when work is steady, this is not nothing. It requires planning. It requires saving. You go to the baths perhaps once a month, sometimes less. Between visits there is the basin and the pump and the cold water and the doing the best you can. But the baths are more than just baths. Your fingers work the type, pulling an E, a U, a R, sliding them into the stick. Your mind works the problem it has been working for 14 months. The city knows things about you that you have not told it. Or rather, the city has a place for you that you have not claimed yet, that you've been circling at a careful distance, that you approach and retreat from like a man testing ice that might or might not bear his weight. You have seen enough now to understand that there are bathhouses in Paris where men go not only to bathe, that the partition between tubs in certain establishments is more than just wood, that the attendant at the door of certain étuves notices who comes and goes with a particular quality of attention that is not just commercial. You have been to the baths 3 times since arriving in Paris, twice to a respectable establishment on Rue des Mathurins, where the water was hot and the cloth was clean, and the attendant was a woman of perhaps 50 who showed no interest in anything except your 3 sous. Once, on a Sunday afternoon in the spring, to a different establishment, smaller, on an alley off Rue Saint-Denis, whose name you'd heard mentioned in a particular tone by a particular man at a particular bookstall, that third visit. That is the one you think about. The attendant at the door was a man, young, with careful eyes that moved over you in a way that asked a question without asking it. You gave him your money. He gave you the cloth. He led you down a corridor to a tub that was in a small partitioned space, open at the top but private on the sides, and the water was hot and dark with some kind of herb, something aromatic, lavender perhaps, or rosemary. And you lowered yourself in, and the heat crept up your body, and you lay still. And for 20 minutes you were clean and warm in a way that Paris had not permitted you to be since you arrived. And while you lay there, someone in the partition next to yours began to speak, a low voice, not loud enough to hear from outside the partition, but perfectly clear to you. He said in French, but with an accent that you couldn't immediately place, something like, "First time?" You didn't answer for a moment. The ice question, does it bear weight? Yes, you said. And the conversation that followed was the first real one you'd had in Paris, the first one that acknowledged who you were and not who you were supposed to be, and it lasted perhaps 10 minutes, during which you never saw his face, only heard a voice through wooden planks, and it changed the city for you in a way that was structural, permanent, the way a key changes a lock not by force, but by fitting. A and V and E and R. Your fingers find the letters without looking. His name, the man in the next tub, was Edouard. He was a laceman, he said, worked on Rue de Clery in the fabric district. He had been in Paris 6 years. He knew the garden. He knew the baths. He knew which taverns and which quays and at what hours. He told you some of it that afternoon, not everything, in the careful incremental way that people in your situation learn to communicate, offering a piece of information and watching to see how it's received before offering another. You had not gone back to that particular bathhouse. Not because of anything Edouard said, but because you were not yet ready for what going back would mean. The ice, you were not sure it bore weight. You were not sure you wanted to find out. There is a comfort in not knowing, in the dark room with the furniture you walk carefully around, and you had been living in that comfort for a long time. But it was September now, 14 months in, and the city was doing something to your patience, wearing it down the way the Seine wears stone, gradually and without announcement, and one morning you would wake up and find that the patience was simply gone, that the careful distance you'd been maintaining had collapsed, and you would have to step either forward or back. You think about all of this while your hands set type, and the presses begin their rhythmic thunder around you, and Maître Renaud's morning proceeds in its precise and ink-scented way. The smell of the printing house is the smell of lead and oil and paper, and beneath those the raw smell of the linseed oil that forms the base of the ink, and it's a smell that has attached itself to your hands and the inside of your nose so thoroughly that you carry it with you out into the street. You can smell yourself sometimes, and it's the printing house, which is better than some of the alternatives Paris offers. At 10 o'clock, Maître Renaud gives a nod that means the first break. You step out the back into the small courtyard that the printing house shares with the bookbinder next door, where the bookbinder's apprentice, a quiet boy named Theodore, who is perhaps 17, is already there eating bread, seated on a crate. You nod at each other. You eat your own bread, brought from the baker on Rue de la Harpe this morning on your way out, paid for with yesterday's sous, a small round loaf that is excellent in the morning and already beginning to turn. By afternoon it will be hard enough to require serious commitment. The courtyard is small, enclosed, with a single elm tree that has somehow forced its way up through the paving stones and now stands perhaps 15 feet tall, its roots lifting the stones around its base into a small geography of cracks and humps. The morning light comes over the top of the building to the east, not yet reaching the tree or the courtyard floor. Above you, 4 stories of windows, mostly shuttered. Paris layered upward, everyone in the same vertical column of air. They found someone, Theodore says, not looking up from his bread. You look at him. He's been at the bookbinder's longer than you've been at the printing house, and he knows the neighbourhood, knows the network of gossip that flows between buildings and workshops and street vendors the way the gutter flows along the street. Found someone where? The garden. He says it without particular emphasis, the way you'd say the market or the church, a location without mystery. But you feel the word land in your chest with weight. When? Last night. One of the police agents, the mouche. He takes a bite of bread. Chews. The man they took was a candle maker from Rue de la Verrerie. Has a wife, 3 children apparently. A mouche, literally a fly. The police inspectors who maintain surveillance of the places, who send their agents in disguised as ordinary men, as working men, as men who might be looking for what you're looking for, who draw out an incautious word or gesture, and then reveal themselves for what they are, and everything falls apart. You've known about the mouches since approximately 3 weeks after you arrived in Paris, when Edouard mentioned them in the bathhouse. He mentioned them the way experienced people mention dangerous things. Precisely, without drama, because the absence of drama is itself the most important lesson. The candle maker, his wife, 3 children, the garden at night. What happens to him, you say, though you know enough of the answer already. Theodore shrugs, not cruelly, more in the way of someone who has absorbed the cruelty of the situation and is now operating in the aftermath of it, where facts are just facts. Bicêtre, probably. Maybe the Bastille if they want to make an example, or if he had the wrong enemies, a pause. Or the galleys, if it's his second time. You eat your bread. The elm tree moves slightly in a breath of air. From the street, the distant calls of vendors. Melons, sweet melons from the south. The rhythm of the city continuing around the private catastrophe of a candle maker whose name you don't know. This is the other half of the equation. This is the weight on the other side of the ice. The police of Paris are, in 1752, the most sophisticated law enforcement apparatus in Europe. The Lieutenant General of Police controls an organisation that includes the commissaires, the inspectors, the watch, and the mouche, the plain-clothed agents who work the streets and the gardens and the taverns and the baths, gathering intelligence on everything from bread prices to seditious pamphlets to the habits of men who meet other men in the dark. The current Lieutenant General is Nicolas René Berrier, and he maintains a staff of inspectors who keep detailed registers of names, occupations, physical descriptions, associates, habits, and offences. The registers for sodomy go back decades. They contain hundreds of names. Some of those names belong to men who are punished. Many belong to men who are warned, cautioned, sent home with their names recorded, and the implicit understanding that the record existed, that it could be reopened, that the police now knew who they were and where they lived and what they did. You don't know if your name is in any register. You have been careful. You have done nothing that anyone could record. You've walked through the garden in the daytime. You talk through a wooden partition to a man named Edouard. These are not crimes, but careful can become a cage if you live in it too long. You finish your bread. Theodore finishes his. The 10 minutes are up and you both go back to your respective workshops without saying anything else. The printing press sounds like a human heartbeat slowed down to half speed. Thud, thud, thud. The weight of the press arm coming down on the form, the type on the paper receiving the image and becoming something it wasn't a moment before. You feed sheets and pull sheets, and the rhythm gets into your body and stays there. At noon, Maître Renaud releases you for an hour. The midday on Rue Saint-Jacques is the street at its most compressed. The students from the Collège de France and the Sorbonne pour out of their buildings and fill the taverns and the food stalls. The merchants and their clerks emerge. The street vendors redouble their efforts. The water carriers move through the crowd with a practiced efficiency that suggests long familiarity with the art of carrying 60 pounds of water through a crowd and not spilling any of it. The smell of food is everywhere. Soup from the traiteurs, those shops that sell cooked food by the bowl, roasting meat from somewhere further along the street. The faint sweetness of the pastry seller who stations himself at the corner of Rue Saint-Jacques and Rue des Mathurins every midday and does excellent business. You buy a bowl of soup from the traiteur. It costs 1 sou. It contains something that might be turnip, something that might be leek, and something you've made peace with not identifying. It's hot. It's filling. You eat it standing up outside in the September sun that has finally managed to get itself above the roof lines, leaning against the wall of the printing house with a bowl warming your hands. Around you, 1,000 midday conversations happening simultaneously. A pair of students arguing about something to do with Locke, or possibly Hobbes, their voices rising in the pleasurable way of young men who have recently encountered philosophy and find it useful for argument. 2 women comparing purchases from the morning market, holding up fabric, examining it in the light. A man sleeping against the wall 3 feet from you with his hat over his face and his hands folded on his stomach, entirely unbothered by the noise. Paris at noon. You think about the candle maker, his wife, 3 children, the garden at night. There are things you cannot know about the candlemaker's situation. You don't know what drove him to the garden at night, whether it was the first time or the 100th, whether he was lonely or desperate or simply who he was and unable to be otherwise in the daytime. You don't know his name. You don't know what the mouche said to him, what words the agent used, how the thing unfolded. You don't know if he wept or fought or simply stood still when they told him what he was and what was going to happen. You know only that he was in the garden and now he is not, and the space his absence leaves is the exact shape of the risk you're managing every day. But you also know something else, something that sits on the other side of the ledger. In the garden, on a Tuesday afternoon in July of this year, you met a man named Guillaume. You were not doing anything. You were walking. You had taken the long route from a delivery on Rue de Rivoli, cutting through the garden because the day was hot and the trees in the garden made shade, and you were in no particular hurry. The gravel paths, the fountains not running because of the summer water rationing, the clipped hedges throwing their geometric shadows. He fell into step beside you so naturally that at first you thought it was accident, the way 2 pedestrians end up walking the same direction at the same pace in a crowded city. But the garden's paths are wide and there was room, and he chose to walk beside you rather than anywhere else. And after 30 seconds of silence, he said very quietly, "You have the look of someone from the south." "Lion," you said. "I'm from Bordeaux," he said. 10 years ago now. You walked together for 20 minutes along the gravel paths in the July heat, and by the end of it you had not said anything that could be written down as evidence of anything. and you had also understood each other completely. Guillaume was 32. He worked for a notary on Ile de la Cité. He had a room on Rue de Bièvre, alone, which was unusual for a man of his means and the city's density, and which he had managed by the specific technique of always paying his rent on time and never making noise, and otherwise becoming invisible to his landlord. He had been in Paris 10 years. He had survived 10 years. He knew things. You ate your soup. The bowl was empty. You handed it back to the traiteur and went back inside. The afternoon passed in type and paper and the rhythm of the press. At 4 o'clock you made a delivery to a legal office on Ile de la Cité, crossing the Petit Pont with a wrapped package under your arm. The Seine below the bridge was low with the dry summer, its banks exposed in a wide strip of dark mud. People were down there scavenging, 2 children poking at the mud with sticks. An old woman bent over something, a dog wading in the shallow edge. The river smelled, at this point in the day, of itself, mud and old water, and the particular quality of a river that has been receiving the city's contributions since before anyone now alive was born. The bridges of Paris are built over moving water, and the water carries things away, most of the time, though not fast enough, and not far enough, and what the river eventually becomes at the sea is not something you want to think about. The legal office was on Rue de la Cité, a narrow building with a steep staircase and a clerk who took your package without looking at you, and closed the door in your face with perfect Parisian efficiency. You descended, crossed back over the bridge, returned to the printing house by 5. Maître Renaud was closing up, rolling down the shutters, blowing out the lamps in the front room. You swept the floor. You washed the ink from your hands with the pumice and soap mixture Renaud kept by the basin. The pumice got under your fingernails and your hands came out raw and pink and trailing the faint ghost of ink that would deepen again tomorrow. Tomorrow, 7 copies of the almanac for the Hôtel Dieu, Renaud said. He said it to the middle distance, not to you specifically. He says things to the middle distance often. After 14 months you've stopped taking it personally. Yes, monsieur. And the paper stock from Périgueux arrives. Don't let them pile it near the east wall. The damp comes in through the stones. Yes, monsieur. He looked at you then, directly, briefly, in the way he occasionally looks at you, like he's doing a quality check. Renaud inspects everything, including people. His expression gave nothing away, as usual. You're doing well, he said. The compositing. Better than I expected for a Lyon man. That was the most personal thing Maître Renaud had said to you in 14 months. Thank you, monsieur. He turned away and the conversation was over. Outside, the September evening was starting, the light going gold over the rooftops, the shadow of the Sorbonne towers falling eastward across the student quarter. You walked back to Rue de la Harpe with your raw hands in your pockets and thought about doing well and what that meant and who it was doing well for. The evening in the room on the 5th floor. Armand is back before you, sitting on his pallet eating a piece of cheese and reading something, a pamphlet of some kind with a lurid illustration on the cover that you decide not to examine closely. Armand is a friendly person in a general unspecific way, the way some people are friendly as a baseline property of their personality, rather than as a response to anything in particular. He grew up in Paris on the right bank, near the temple enclosure. He knows the city the way you know Lyon, in his body, without thinking about it. He knows things about it you'll never know because you came to it as an adult, after it was already formed. He looks up when you come in. There's bread left, he says. gesturing at the windowsill where a piece of yesterday's bread sits under a cloth. "The cheese I'm finishing, don't ask." "I wasn't going to." "Good." He goes back to his pamphlet. You eat the bread. You pour water from the pitcher into the basin and wash your face again, because the afternoon delivery had raised a sweat. You sit on your pallet and take your stockings off and look at your feet, which have walked the cobblestones of Paris for 14 months and have opinions about it. There's a blister on the heel of your left foot from a shoe that rubs. You've been meaning to take it to the cobbler for 3 weeks. "They found someone in the garden last night," Armand says, still reading. "I heard." "A candle maker." "I heard." Armand turns a page. "They say Berrier's men are doing a sweep, the whole autumn, going through all the usual places." He says it the same way Theodore said it, with the particular tonelessness of someone conveying practical information, not judgment, just information. Paris, with its 800,000 souls and its 50 years of French Enlightenment starting to seep into the groundwater, has produced a generation of young men who know what the garden means and do not particularly think about it one way or another unless it becomes personally relevant. A sweep, you say. That's what they're saying on the Rue Saint-Denis. He sets down the pamphlet, looks at you with a slightly more focused attention of someone who has said something they want a response to. "You should be careful." There is a moment, a very small one, in which the room is only the room, the bread smell and the cesspit smell, and the amber glow of the single tallow candle, and Armand is looking at you with an expression that is simply kind, without anything more complicated behind it, just the basic human kindness of a man who has shared a room and a water basin with another man for a year, and has formed, without ceremony, a preference for his continued survival. "I know," you say. He nods, picks up the pamphlet again. The conversation is over, complete in itself, nothing more required. You sit with it for a moment, the fact of being seen in that small, specific and entirely tolerable way. It's not the same as the garden. It's not the same as the bathhouse. It's just Armand telling you to be careful, which is the same thing he'd say if you were working with the inkwash too close to an oil lamp. The candle burns down. You both sleep. The city below continues its business. 3 days later, on a Thursday, you go to the baths, not the respectable establishment on Rue des Mathurins, the other one. You've been thinking about it for 3 days. The candle maker, the mouche, Armand saying be careful. Edward's voice through the partition a year ago. Guillaume in the garden in July. The ice question. Does it bear weight? It's not bravery. You don't call it that. It's more like the thing that happens when you've been careful long enough that the carefulness starts to cost more than whatever it's protecting you from. You know you can go on being careful. You know you can spend the next 10 years of your life in the dark room with the furniture, moving around it at a distance and survive perfectly well. You've seen men do it. You've met men in Paris who've done it for decades, who've walled themselves into a life of perfect surfaces, who are polite to their landladies and punctual at their work, and who grow old in rooms that smell of nothing, because they've made themselves into nothing successfully. You're 23 years old. The establishment on the alley off Rue Saint-Denis is called, according to the sign, the Bain de Saint-Denis, though it has nothing to do with the actual Rue Saint-Denis except proximity. You find the alley at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on your half-day Thursday and stop for a moment at its entrance. The alley is 3 feet wide. The buildings on either side lean toward each other slightly at the top the way old buildings do, their stones settling into each other with the familiarity of long coexistence. The sign is small, painted, showing a simplified illustration of a bathing tub with steam rising from it. Below the image, the price list, painted in smaller letters you have to step closer to read. 3 sous for the steam room, 5 sous for a tub, 8 sous for a private tub with attendant service. You go in. The door opens into a small room with a wooden counter, behind which sits a young man with a broad face and very still eyes. He looks at you for approximately 2 seconds before he speaks, and in those 2 seconds you understand that he is conducting the same quality check that Maître Renaud conducts, except for entirely different qualities. A tub, you say. Private. 8 sous, he says. You pay. He takes the coins with fingers that touch yours for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and the fraction of a second is not accidental. He hands you a folded cloth. He leads you down a corridor that smells of steam and the herbs they put in the water, rosemary definitely, and something underneath it, wood and wet stone. The corridor is dim, lit by a single oil lamp at the far end, and the doors on either side are closed, and from behind some of them you can hear water moving, or silence, or the quiet of 2 people not making noise on purpose. The tub is in a room at the end of the corridor. It's a wooden barrel shape large enough for 1 person, on a platform with a drain hole. The water in it is hot, steaming, dark with herbs. There's a stool beside it for your clothes, a hook on the wall for your coat. The room is perhaps 6 feet by 6 feet and closes properly with a latch. You undress slowly, the September afternoon light coming through a narrow high window in a single bar of dusty gold. Your shirt stiff with the week's work, your breeches, your stockings with the blister-rubbed heel. Your skin, when you stand in the steam of the tub, feels the heat immediately, the way skin does when it has not been warm for a while, and then suddenly there is warmth, and every pore opens toward it like a turning face. You lower yourself into the water. The heat is a physical thing, a presence that moves up your body as you descend into it, your feet, your calves, your thighs, your stomach, your chest. The herbs in the water have opened to the heat, and the rosemary is dense and green in the air. You sink until your shoulders are submerged, and you rest your head back against the rim of the tub and close your eyes, and for a few minutes there is nothing but heat, and the smell of rosemary, and the sound of your own slow breathing. The water is the colour of weak tea. It is not clean by any absolute standard. It has held someone else before you, or the herbs have been steeping since the morning, but it is warm, which is more than your basin offers, and it covers your whole body, which is more than your basin can do, and you are briefly, genuinely, completely clean in the sense that matters. A sound from beyond the partition wall, not alarming, just the sound of someone settling into a tub on the other side, water moving. A long exhale, the sound of a body releasing itself into heat. You don't speak first. You've learned that. You wait. After perhaps 2 minutes, good water today. A voice, male, middle-aged, with the broad vowels of a Parisian who grew up close to the river. Yes, you say. Silence. Then, first time here in a while? A year. I remember. A pause. Not threatening, considering. You spoke with Edouard. Something in your chest tightens just slightly, then releases. Yes. He's not in Paris anymore. He went to Lyon in the spring. Another pause. You're from Lyon? Yes. There's irony in that. You can hear that he's smiling without seeing him. My name is Sébastien. I work on Rue des Lombards, metalwork. Jean-Baptiste, printing on Rue Saint-Jacques. Good trade. He said it the way a man says something he means. The book trade is the future, or so they keep telling us. They might be right. The water had cooled slightly on the surface while you talked, and you shifted, pushing the heat back up. Outside the window, September afternoon sounds. A cart. A child's voice. The ordinary life of Paris passing a few feet from where you were doing something that could have you in the Bicêtre by morning if the door opened incorrectly. This is the thing that does not go away. This is the underlay of every moment in the bathhouse and the garden and every other place. It doesn't cancel the warmth of the water or the smell of rosemary or the particular relief of being, for a moment, known rather than unknown. It exists alongside those things, permanently, like the cesspit smell alongside the bread smell. This is Paris. It contains everything simultaneously. There's a sweep happening, Sebastian said. His voice was careful but not afraid. A man transmitting information, not alarm. I heard. You heard right. Berrier's having one of his seasons. It comes around. Every year or two he decides to clean up, which means the mouches are working the garden and the Luxembourg and the quay. A brief silence. Not here, not yet, but be careful. That seems to be the general advice. It's good advice. He shifted in his tub. You heard the water move. Tell me something. How long have you been here? In Paris? 14 months. And you've been careful for all 14 months. It wasn't exactly a question. Yes. That takes a particular kind of will, Sebastian said, or a particular kind of fear. You didn't answer that. I was like that, he said, for about 2 years after I came to Paris. Careful to the point of paralysis. Couldn't look at anyone. Couldn't be anywhere. Every time I walked past the garden, I looked at the pavement. A pause. You know what that does to you after a while? Tell me. It makes you invisible even to yourself. You do it long enough, and you forget what you're hiding. There's just the hiding. He said it without particular emotion, reporting a historical fact about himself. I'm not saying be reckless. I'm saying there's a middle place between reckless and invisible, and it exists, and you can live in it. The water had grown cooler. You pushed at the surface with your hand, watching the motion propagate. Outside, the cart had moved on. The child's voice was gone. How do you know which is which, you said. A sound that might have been a quiet laugh. You learn. It takes time. You learn who to trust and how fast to trust them and what the signs are. You learn the mouche from the real men usually. They're too eager, too easy, too much of what you're looking for right there on the surface. A pause. Usually. And when you get it wrong? Silence for a few seconds. People get it wrong. Yes, the candlemaker got it wrong. Or the candlemaker was unlucky, or the candlemaker was just there at the wrong time. All of those are possible. His voice was quiet. You can't let that be the whole story. There are also people who've been living in this city for 20 years, 30 years, who know how to be who they are and survive. You can do that too. You sat in the cooling water and thought about the candlemaker and the man who'd lived 30 years, and whether those were the same man or different men, and what the difference between them was, if it was skill or luck or simply timing. Sebastian left first. You heard him climb out of his tub, heard the sounds of dressing, and then a knock on the partition, once brief. There's a place, he said through the wood, quietly, en rue du Temple, a wine shop called Chez Moreau. Tuesday evenings, the back room. Nothing dramatic. Just men having wine. A pause. If you want to know what the middle place looks like. Then the sound of footsteps, and the corridor and the door, and he was gone. You stayed in the cooling water for another 10 minutes, looking at the bar of September light from the narrow window, which had moved from gold to the particular warm grey of late afternoon, and thought about the middle place, and what it looked like, and whether the ice bore weight. You got out, dried yourself with the rough linen cloth, dressed. The clean feeling lasted approximately as long as it took you to get to the end of the alley and re-enter the general smell of Paris, which accepted you back without comment. The Rue du Temple is in the Marais, on the right bank, which means crossing the Seine, which means either paying a waterman or using one of the bridges. You took the Pont Notre Dame that evening, not heading to Chez Moreau but just walking, as you often walk in the evenings when the day's work is done and the room on Rue de la Harpe is slightly too small for all your thoughts. The bridge is lined with shops, tall buildings on either side blocking the view of the river, until you lean over the rail at the midpoint and look down. The water below is brown and moving. Boats pass under you, the flat-bottomed bateau loaded with stone and timber and coal. A laundress's boat is moored to the piling, her washing lines strung between poles on the deck, sheets and shirts hanging limp in the still evening air. Paris does its laundry in the Seine. This is notable because Paris also deposits everything else in the Seine, and the two activities overlap spatially, but this is not something that occupies most people particularly. You wash where the water is the river. The river also contains everything else. You have adapted to this the way you adapt to everything in Paris, which is by not thinking about it directly while being viscerally aware of it at all times. The laundresses are a particular presence in the city. They work in the river, often in the water up to their knees or their thighs, pounding cloth on the wooden frames of the bateaux lavoirs, the floating laundry boats. They're strong women with forearms and backs built for it, and they're organised, with their own guild, their own hierarchies, their own territorial knowledge of which stretch of river belongs to which establishment. They also know things. The laundresses know a remarkable amount about the city because they see what comes off people's bodies, which is a comprehensive record of how people live. You watch the laundress on the boat below working by the light of a lamp now that the evening had darkened, still pounding, steady, rhythmic, while the Seine carried its cargo of city around her. A city reveals itself differently to different people. To Maître Renaud it is a commercial organism, a network of clients and suppliers and printing contracts and guild obligations. To Armand it's a neighbourhood, specific streets and specific faces, and the particular feel of the right bank where he grew up. To Theodore, the bookbinder's apprentice, it's probably still terrifying and too large. To the laundress on the boat, it's the river and the clothes and the weight of wet cloth and the money she makes at the end of the week. To you, it's all of those things, and underneath them all, invisible to most but not to you, is another city. The one Edouard told you about through a wooden partition, and Guillaume walked you through in the garden, and Sébastien named this afternoon. The city that exists in the spaces between the visible one, the garden paths, the bath partitions, the back room of a wine shop on Rue du Temple. You leaned on the bridge rail for a long time, looking at the river. Tuesday was 4 days away. The 4 days passed the way working days pass in a printing house, which is to say quickly and indistinguishably, one long rhythm of type and paper and ink, a consignment of almanacs, an order for 50 copies of a devotional pamphlet for a parish on the Ile de la Cité, a small rush job for a lawyer who needed 20 copies of a document by Thursday afternoon, and was willing to pay accordingly, which meant you and Renaud and the other compositor, a man named Fabre who was taciturn and excellent, worked through the lunch hour and most of the afternoon. The paper from Périgueux arrived Tuesday morning, and you refused to let them stack it near the east wall. and the delivery man looked at you with the expression people reserve for young men who are acting on instructions rather than judgment, and you held your ground and eventually stacked it where Renaud wanted it. You ate, you slept, you washed your face in cold water every morning, you changed your shirt on Saturday, which was the shirt day, the day you washed the shirt you'd been wearing and put on the other one and waited for the first to dry, hanging it near the window and hoping it dried before the evening damp caught it. You polished your shoes with the small tin of wax Armand kept on a shelf and shared without being asked. You were a person doing ordinary things in an ordinary way, and nobody looking at you on the street would have seen anything else. Tuesday came. You finished work at 5, walked home to the room on Rue de la Harpe, ate a piece of bread and the remains of a soup Armand had made, which was better than it had any right to be given the ingredients he'd had available, changed into your better coat, not your work coat. The better coat is not substantially better, being the same wool, but it's darker and has fewer ink stains and buttons that all match. It is the coat of a man who is going somewhere rather than a man who has just come from somewhere. Armand watched you put it on without saying anything. Then, "Where are you going?" "A wine shop, on Rue du Temple." A pause. "With who?" "People." You looked at him. "Men." He looked at you for a moment, and in the moment there was the same small, specific awareness as before, the same quality of simply seeing what was there. "Be back before midnight," he said. "The landlord bolts the gate at midnight, and he's been in a mood." "I know, and be careful." "I know, Armand." He went back to his pamphlet. You went downstairs. The Rue du Temple at 7 in the evening is the Marais district coming out for the night. The craftsmen and merchants and their families. The Jewish quarter a few streets north with its own evening rhythms. The taverns opening their shutters to the mild September air. The smell of the streets settling as the day traffic eased and the night traffic began. You crossed the Seine via the Pont au Change, which was quieter than the Pont Notre Dame, and wound through the right bank by a route you'd learned from Guillaume, through streets you'd walked before, past the church of Saint-Gervais, and through the Rue des Bars, with its particular fish smell from the Monday market that still hung in the air 2 days later. Chez Moreau was easy to find and easy to miss, which is probably intentional. A wine shop occupying the ground floor of a building on a street where there were 4 other wine shops, so unremarkable in the landscape of the street that your eye skated over it twice before catching the sign. A simple board with a bottle painted on it, no name visible from the street. The door was open, spilling warm light and the smell of cheap wine and lamp oil. Inside, the front room was a wine shop. Tables, barrels along one wall, a counter with a man behind it who looked at you with the same careful eyes as the bathhouse attendant, the same quality of seeing more than the surface. "I was told to ask about the back room," you said. Your voice came out steadier than you expected. He studied you for a moment. "By who?" "Sébastien, from Rue des Lombards." A nod. A gesture toward a door at the back of the room, behind a barrel of Burgundy that was serving as partition. The back room was not large, perhaps 20 feet by 15, 7 men, including you now, candles on the tables, cheap wine in clay cups, a smell of tobacco and wax and the specific warmth of a small room with people in it. Nobody looked at you as a stranger. Nobody looked at you as anything in particular, which is its own kind of welcome. You took a seat at one of the tables and a cup appeared in front of you, and the wine in it was warm and sour and exactly right. For a Tuesday evening in September, after a month of thinking about whether the ice bears wait, Sébastien was there, in the corner, in conversation with an older man whose hands were enormous and scarred, in the way of someone who works with hot metal. He caught your eye across the room and lifted his cup slightly. No more, and you returned the gesture. The men in the room were not remarkable. That was the thing you noticed first and kept noticing. They were workmen, artisans, one or two who might have been clerks or minor merchants. They ranged from perhaps 20 to perhaps 60. Some were talking, some listening. One was reading something by the candlelight with the absorbed attention of a man who reads whenever he can, because he has not always been able to. There was nothing furtive about the room, nothing that looked like what you'd imagined, if you'd imagined anything at all, which you'd tried not to do. It looked like men having wine on a Tuesday evening. Because that's what it was. That's what Sebastien had said. Nothing dramatic, just men having wine. The man who sat down across from you was perhaps 35, with a thin face and a way of sitting that suggested he was usually standing. That sitting was a temporary concession to the evening's requirements. He introduced himself as Marcel, a bookbinder, and when you said you worked in a printing house, he lit up with the pleasure of adjacent industries recognizing each other. Which shop? Renault on Saint-Jacques. Renault. He nodded. Good work. I've had his printed sheets. Clean registration. This was high praise in the book trades, where misaligned type was a mark of incompetence. I work for Dumont on Rue de la Pacheminerie. We see a fair bit of what comes off Renault's press. You talked about the book trades for 20 minutes, which is not what you'd expected to talk about, and which was also entirely what you'd expected to talk about, because the middle place that Sebastien described is not a place where everything is about one thing. It's a place where people are simply people, who work at their trades and have opinions about the quality of printed sheets and drink cheap wine on Tuesday evenings, and happen also to be exactly what the police would like to know about. After a while, the conversation drifted toward other things, the way conversations drift. The sweep, Berrier's men, the candle maker. His name was Théophile, said the older man with the metalworker's hands, whom Sebastien had introduced as Robert. He worked on Rue de la Verrerie. His wife is still there. Someone is taking up a collection for the children. A quiet around the table for a moment. He knew the mouches, someone said from another table. He'd been warned about them. Knowing and avoiding are different things, Robert said. Another silence. The thing about the mouches, Marcel said, his voice lowered, is that they've gotten better at it. They used to be obvious. You could always tell. Too well dressed for the neighbourhood. Too eager. Asking the wrong questions. He turned his cup in his hands. Now they're better. They spend time. They build trust. They become regulars at a place before they make an arrest. So how do you tell, you said? He looked at you, not unkindly. You don't always. Which is why you stay careful. Why you don't meet someone once and tell them everything. Why you take time. He paused. Like this. Coming here tonight. Sebastien knows you more or less. I know Sebastien, we're careful. You thought about the man in the next tub, the voice through the partition, the 2 seconds at the counter when the attendant's fingers touched yours, the ice again, wait again. Théophile was not careless, Robert said firmly. He was unlucky. Sometimes there is no lesson. Sometimes a man who has done everything right gets taken anyway, and you have to live with the fact that the risk doesn't disappear just because you're careful. That sat in the room for a moment. Then someone at another table said something about a play at the Comédie Française that had everyone laughing because apparently the lead actor had forgotten his lines in the second act, and improvised in a way that was either brilliant or disastrous, depending on your expectations. And the conversation turned, and the room breathed again, and the candles burned, and the wine went around. You stayed for 2 hours. You walked home across the dark city, through streets lit only by the upper floor lanterns required by ordinance but often not lit, through the smell of September Paris at night, through the narrow passages where you kept to the centre to avoid the drips from above, across the bridge with the moving water below. You got back to Rue de la Harpe at 10:30, through the gate that was not yet bolted, up the stairs that squeaked on the 3rd step, and the 7th and the 14th. Armand was asleep. You took off your better coat and hung it carefully and sat on the edge of your pallet and thought about the middle place and what it actually felt like to be in it, and found that it felt mostly like Tuesday evenings with cheap wine and men who work at their trades, which is also, you were beginning to understand exactly what it's supposed to feel like. October came in with rain. Paris in the rain is a different city from Paris in the summer, not worse necessarily, just different in the way that requires you to rebuild your relationship with the streets. The gutters, which in summer are thick and slow, become in October proper rivers, carrying the rain and everything it collects from the street stones, flowing hard down to the drains and the Seine and whatever lies beyond. The cobblestones become slick, polished by rain and hoof and foot, and you learn the particular light step required to navigate them without ending up horizontal. Several people end up horizontal. You pass them, help where you can, keep moving. The smell of Paris in rain is the smell of the dry stuff dissolving. All the accumulated weeks of street dust and horse residue, and dropped food and shed skin, all of it reconstituting into something active and immediate. You breathe October Paris through your coat collar, pulled up, trying to keep the rain from running down the back of your neck. Work at the printing house in October. More almanacs, because the almanac season is beginning and everyone in Paris wants to know what next year holds in terms of astronomy, planting calendars, feast days, and the general disposition of the heavens toward human affairs. The almanacs are small pamphlets, perhaps 16 pages, and they sell for a sou apiece, and Renault prints 10,000 of them in batches of 100 and sells them to colporteurs, the street hawkers who carry them through the city in their baskets. You set type for almanacs for 3 weeks. By the end of the 3rd week, you know next year's calendar better than you know your own face. You also go to Chez Moreau 3 more Tuesday evenings. Each time, the room is different and the same. Different combinations of men, though Robert the metalworker is always there, becoming something like a fixed point in the geography of the back room, and Marcel the bookbinder appears on 2 of the 3 evenings, and each time you see Sebastian you understand that the trust is building in the incremental way he described, brick by careful brick. On the 3rd Tuesday you arrive, and there is a man you've not seen before. He is perhaps 40, with the bearing of someone who has spent time in the military or the church, very straight, very composed, with a face that has been handsome and is now something more interesting than handsome, marked by weather and time. He is introduced to you as Friedrich, and he works, he says, in the household of a minor nobleman on Faubourg Saint-Germain as a secretary. A secretary, you say. A very useful thing to be, he says, without irony. One has access to correspondence. One understands the movements of the household. One is, for practical purposes, invisible to everyone above one in the hierarchy. He takes a drink of wine. An invisible man can do many things. You look at him and think about invisibility, which is a concept you've been living inside for 14 months and are only now beginning to examine from the outside. You've been invisible for a long time, you ask. Most of my life. He looks at you evenly. You? I'm still learning how visible I'm allowed to be. He nods, as if this is a completely ordinary statement, which perhaps to him it is. The trick, he says, is to understand that visibility is not binary. People think it's one thing or the other. You're seen or you're not. But that's not how it works. You choose what to show and to whom and in what light. He looks around the room at the other men talking and drinking. All of these men are visible to someone who knows how to look. To Berrier's agents, we're a threat to be managed. To our employers, we're reliable workers. To our landladies, we're quiet tenants who pay on time. To each other, he pauses, to each other, we're just men. Just men, having wine on a Tuesday. The October rain drummed on the roof of the building above the back room of Chez Moreau, and you sat with it for a moment. The simplicity of it, which is also a kind of statement about what the complication costs. What happens if someone in here is a mouche? You said. It was something you'd thought about on every visit, the question you'd been turning over, and it came out now the way questions come out when the wine has lowered the part of you that usually holds them in. The room didn't go quiet. No one looked over. Frederick didn't flinch. Then someone in here is a mouche, he said. And that's a risk we've assessed and decided to take, because the alternative is the dark room and the furniture, and some of us have already lived there and found it insufficient. A pause. You learn the signs, not perfectly. Nothing is perfect, but you learn them well enough to manage the risk to a level you can live with. And if you get it wrong, then you get it wrong, and you deal with that when it happens. He looked at you steadily. You can't build a life around the worst possible outcome, or rather, you can, but it won't be much of a life. You thought about the candle maker, Théophile, the wife on Rue de la Verrerie, the 3 children, the collection being taken up. That's not nothing, you said. Getting it wrong? No, Frederick agreed, it's not nothing. Getting it wrong can cost everything. I'm not telling you the risk is small. I'm telling you the risk exists, that it is real and specific, and has real and specific consequences, and that you nonetheless have to decide what kind of life you want to live inside that risk. He set his cup down. Some men decide the risk is too high, and they live accordingly. I respect that. Some men decide they want to know what's on the other side of the risk, and they live accordingly. I respect that too. He looked at you. I don't know which kind of man you are. I suspect you're still finding out. Yes, you said, that's exactly right. He smiled at that briefly, and the smile made him look younger than the composed exterior suggested. You're still finding out, this is correct, and the finding out happens in October in a back room on Rue du Temple over cheap wine, while the rain makes the city outside into something slightly different from what it usually is. Slightly softer, the edges blurred by water, the light diffused through clouds into something that makes Paris look, briefly, like the city and the paintings of it, idealized and glowing. The bathhouse question, the one you've been managing, is also changing shape, because there is something specific about the bathhouses that is not just social. There is the physical fact of them, the actual need they address, the basic bodily requirement for hot water that Paris's infrastructure provides no other way to meet. You think about this sometimes while you're washing your face in cold water from the basin before dawn. You think about the Roman city that was here before Paris was Paris, the Lutetia that the Romans built on the left bank around the 1st century, which had proper baths, the thermae, heated water delivered through a system of pipes and hypocausts. The ruins of those baths still exist on the left bank, incorporated into later construction, and you've walked past them on your way to deliveries. The Collège de France stands partly over them, the stones of two civilizations stacked on each other. And one civilization had hot water whenever it wanted it, and the other one carries it up 5 flights of stairs in a bucket. It's a particular kind of poverty, the poverty of hygiene, that doesn't announce itself as poverty because everyone shares it, because the king at Versailles doesn't bathe substantially more often than you do, because the question of clean has a different answer here and now than it will have later, if later means a world with pipes and pressure and water from the wall. Here and now, clean is a practice and a discipline, and also, for some people, a luxury. And the difference between those categories is money, always money. The étuves are public because the alternative is no bathing at all for most of the population, and the city's authorities have a complicated relationship with public bathing that goes back centuries. There were once many more bathhouses in Paris, in the medieval period, a whole culture of public bathing that was apparently more Mediterranean than what followed it. Then the Black Death and the medical theories that came with it, the idea that open pores let in miasma and disease, the idea that bathing was dangerous, that the skin should be kept closed and defended rather than open to the air and water. That theory held for a long time, longer than you'd think. Even now, in 1752, there are physicians who counsel against full immersion bathing as a health risk. Most people in Paris manage somewhere between never and once a month. The once-a-month people are the clean ones by the standards of the time and place. The never people are the majority, especially in the poorer neighbourhoods, where the water is difficult to get and the space to use it is non-existent, and the priority is staying alive by simpler measures. Food, warmth, rent. You're somewhere in between. Once a month to the baths if you can afford it, daily cold water face and hands, weekly shirt change. This puts you in the reasonable range for a working man of your station. It puts your clothes in the range of wearable without causing offence to others, most of the time, unless you've been running in the heat, unless the August sun has been working on the back of your coat all afternoon. The specific intimacy of the bathhouse, the men around you in various states of undress, the voices through the partitions, the attendants' careful eyes. All of this exists inside the larger fact of what the bathhouse is, which is a place where the city temporarily suspends the normal rules of separation, where bodies are acknowledged rather than covered, where the basic animal need for warmth and water is addressed collectively because there is no private infrastructure to address it individually. In that suspension, other things are possible, have always been possible. The Romans knew it, the medieval bathhouse culture knew it, the police of 1752 Paris know it, which is why the bathhouses are on the list of places the mouches frequent. The suspension doesn't make things safe, but it makes them possible. November arrived in Paris with the cold that Paris cold means, which is a specific variety of damp that gets into the stones and the wooden floors and the clothes you put on in the morning, so that you start the day already slightly chilled and spend the rest of it trying to get the chill out without sufficient fuel for the stove. Armand had a contact who could sometimes get charcoal at better prices than the coal merchants on the main streets, and you pulled your sou and bought a supply that would get you through to December if you were conservative, and you were conservative. The room on the 5th floor of the building on Rue de la Harpe in November is the room the temperature made. The brazier in the corner put out enough heat to make the air around it bearable. Away from the brazier, your breath showed in the morning. The water in the basin froze if you left it overnight. The walls sweated a particular November damp that turned the lower stones a darker colour. You slept in your coat. So did Armand. The printing house was warmer, relatively speaking, because the presses generated heat, and Renault kept a proper stove going in the back room from October through March, and you discovered that arriving slightly early at the printing house in November was not only good professionally but physically advisable, because you could stand near the stove for 10 minutes before work began and take some of the chill out of your hands, which didn't work well cold, which mattered for the typesetting, which meant the stove was a professional resource as much as a personal comfort. The Parisian winter was something else you were learning. The winter of a city is different from the winter of a small town. In Lyon, winter meant staying indoors more, staying near the fire, the rhythm slowing. In Paris, winter meant the streets reconfiguring. The Seine sometimes froze in the very coldest weeks, though this winter it didn't. The river running grey and fast and smoking with the cold. The laundresses' boats pulled up on the banks and their work suspended because wet cloth in January weather was an act of considerable misery. The water carriers worked shorter routes because the ice made some streets impassable. The colporteurs, who sold books and pamphlets and almanacs in the streets, wrapped themselves in everything they owned and called their wares, in voices roughened by cold. You made deliveries in November with your hands in your pockets between each destination, the package tucked under your arm, your breath making small clouds in the grey air. The Seine from the bridges looked iron-coloured, heavy, carrying the winter city's weight. Chez Moreau on Tuesdays in November was warmer than the 5th floor on Rue de la Harpe, because there were bodies in the back room and a stove, and you started to think of Tuesday evenings less as an exercise in navigating risk, and more simply as the warmest part of your week, which is a shift in perspective that might seem small but isn't. Guillaume was there one Tuesday in November, the man from the garden in July, and you sat across from each other and drank the wine that was worse in November for some reason, possibly because the barrel was newer, and talked about the city in winter and what it cost to keep warm and where the good charcoal came from, and the general question of how to survive November in a room with a brazier and inadequate walls. It was the most domestic conversation you'd had in Paris, also one of the most pleasant. He was 33 in November, you learned, the same age as Armand nearly. He'd been in Paris 11 years and had learned in those 11 years the art of making a single room livable through accretion. The heavy curtain over the door to stop the draught, the rug on the floor that wasn't decorative but practical, the way you position your bed relative to the window versus the wall to get the most warmth, the small tricks of thermal comfort that cities in cold climates develop through necessity. He described his room on Rue de Bièvre with the detail of someone who has thought carefully about it. The window faces east, he said, which means sun in the morning, nothing in the afternoon. In December, the morning sun is so low it comes in almost horizontally, hits the floor, warms the stones. He turned his cup. The stones hold heat for an hour after the sun moves, so December mornings, the floor is warmer than the air. You've been paying close attention. When you live alone, you pay attention to what the room does. There's nobody else to manage the cold. A pause, not uncomfortable. Do you live alone? With Armand. We share the attic. He nodded. 2 people in a room is warmer than 1. There's physics in that. A slight smile. Not always comfortable physics, but warm. You talked about other things. The sweep, which had eased somewhat in November according to what people in the back room were saying. Berryer moving his attention to something else. The mouches perhaps reassigned. The garden less monitored. This was not something to relax about, Frederick had said on another evening, because the easing always preceded a new intensity. You had to learn the rhythm of the thing to navigate it, which took years, which is why the men who'd been here for decades were worth knowing. The thing about the back room at Chez Moreau that you were still absorbing 3 months after first walking through the door was that it was not organised around anything except the basic fact of being who everyone in it was. There were no rituals, no particular language beyond the ordinary kind, no identifying costume or gesture, nothing that would show in a police register as evidence of anything except men drinking wine on Tuesday evenings. What there was instead was a quality of attention, the way men in the room listened to each other, which was different from the way men listen in the front room of a tavern. More particular, more patient. The absence of competition for the particular kind of status that men in groups of men usually compete for. Something quieter. Something that took you time to name, and when you named it, what you called it was simply ease. You did not feel easy in many places. You felt competent at the printing house, which was different. You felt safe at Chez Moreau in a technical sense, as safe as the calculations could make you, which was not the same as easy. You felt comfortable in the room with Armand, which was domestic comfort, the comfort of familiarity. But in the back room, on Tuesday evenings, after the first glass of wine, you started to feel a thing that took you months to recognise because you had so little prior experience of it. The thing you eventually called, to yourself, quietly, being among people who are also themselves. It's not dramatic. It shouldn't be, but it is. December arrived with the cold that settled in for months and the preparations for the Advent season, which in Paris meant the churches filling and the markets filling, and the smell of the city changing to include roasting chestnuts from the vendors who appeared on corners from November to February, and you bought chestnuts when you could afford them, which was not always, and ate them warm from the paper cone on your way home from the printing house, the heat of them moving through the cone into your palms. Maître Renaud gave you at the end of November a bonus, 3 livres. It was not enormous. It was significant. He gave it in the same middle-distance way he gave most things, explaining that the almanac work had been well done, and the legal office order had been completed on time, and the paper from Périgueux was properly stored, and had not, in fact, developed damp problems. 3 livres. You split them carefully between the charcoal fund, the rent, the emergency reserve you kept in a cloth bag under the corner of your mattress, and a pair of warm stockings from the market on Rue de Mouffetard that were exactly what your feet had been asking for since October. You went to the baths in December with 2 livres saved from the bonus, to the Bain de Saint-Denis, and you lay in the hot water for half an hour and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill, the skill of empty presence in warmth. And when you got out and dressed, the cold hit you immediately, but underneath it, for an hour, was the warmth of the water still in your skin, fading slowly. Sebastian was not there in December. He had gone, someone told you, to visit family in the south for the Christmas period, which was apparently something he did every year, keeping up the appearance of the family ties that every man in the back room kept up in their own way. The family was not decorative, you were learning. The family was strategy, the network of ordinary life that you maintained around the hidden one, not because you were ashamed of the hidden life, but because the maintenance of the ordinary one was what kept the hidden one possible. This is the middle place. The ordinary life running alongside the hidden one, each sustaining the other, neither one able to exist without the other's cover. The candlemaker's wife and 3 children were cover, yes, but they were also real, also their own lives, also people who would be devastated by what happened, which is why the devastation, when it comes, is not only his. This is the cost that isn't only borne by the man taken. You thought about the cost on the walk home from the baths in December, through the cold streets, through the steam of the roasting chestnut vendor, whose operation was one of the warmer spots in the neighbourhood. You bought one portion and ate them walking, and thought about the people in the back room and what their ordinary lives looked like. Who knew, who didn't, who was maintaining what kind of cover. Marcel the bookbinder had no family in Paris. He lived alone and attributed this to the economics of his trade. Robert the metalworker had a wife and 2 daughters, and attended church every Sunday with them, and was, by all accounts, an attentive husband and father. Frederick the nobleman's secretary had never mentioned family or the absence of it, which was itself a kind of answer, the invisibility he described as a strategy being total enough to include his personal history. Guillaume lived alone on Rue de Bièvre and paid his rent on time and was polite to his landlord. And you had a room with Armand and work at a printing house, and a father from Lyon who wrote occasional letters inquiring about your progress, and a mother who sent food packages twice a year, the most recent of which had included a sausage from Lyon that was so perfectly made you ate it over 4 days in small careful portions to make it last. The food from home, that's its own category. The things that come from before Paris, from the places where you were someone different, or rather where you were not yet fully yourself, where the process that's been happening here in the 14 months was only beginning. The sausage from Lyon with its particular Lyonnaise taste, the combination of pork and herbs and the slight smokiness of the way they cure it in that region. Your mother made it or supervised its making, and the fact of it on Rue de la Harpe in September, when the package arrived, was a kind of translation problem, the 2 places existing simultaneously in the taste of it. You wrote back regularly. You described the printing house. You described the food, modestly. You described the city in terms that would be comprehensible and reassuring, which was a particular kind of writing, the letter-home version of yourself, which was not false but was edited, which is not the same as false, which is just the ordinary work of being a person in multiple places at once. January, February. The winter deepening and the city adjusting to it with the slow adaptations of a city that has been doing winter for centuries. The Seine did not freeze. The gutters did, in the very cold weeks, which meant the gutters were temporarily clean. Their contents crystallized into a form that couldn't flow and so just stayed there, grey-white, smelling of cold. You learned to avoid the gutters in a different way in January than in summer. In summer you avoided stepping into them. In January you avoided stepping on the ice crust that formed over them, because the crust looked solid and was not, and a misstep meant a boot through ice into whatever was underneath. A boot through ice into the Paris gutter. You did this once in the first week of February, on a delivery errand near the Rue de la Verrerie, and you thought of the candle maker as you pulled your boot out, because this was his street, or had been, and somewhere behind one of these doors was his wife and his 3 children managing without him. The boot was ruined for the day. You walked the rest of the delivery with one foot slightly wetter than the other, the cold of it moving up through the stocking, and you thought about Théophile. You didn't know Théophile. He was not a person you'd met. He was a piece of information in the city's ongoing information about itself, a name that moved through the network of the back room and the bathhouse and the garden with the weight that names acquire when they carry a story. But you thought about him because the street made you think about him, and because thinking about him was also thinking about yourself, about the specific contingency of your position, the particular thread between the state you're in now and the state he's in, and the thread is thinner than the gutters allow. Frederick came and found you at the printing house one Wednesday afternoon in February. This was unusual. The back room was Tuesday evenings. The rest of the week, the men you'd met there existed only in their ordinary lives, and if you crossed paths on the street you might nod but wouldn't speak more than necessary. The standard calibration of public distance. But Frederick appeared at the printing house door in the afternoon, asked for Jean-Baptiste Courbet, and Fabre the compositor gave him the look he gave everyone, and called you over with a jerk of his head. Frederick was wearing his working clothes, the dark coat and sober neckwear of a secretary. He asked quietly if you could step outside for a moment. Renaud was in the back. Fabre was already looking away, indifferent. The street was cold. February afternoon, the weak sun not managing to warm anything. "There's an inspector," Frederick said. His voice was the same composed instrument as always, but there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there in the back room. Not Berrier's man specifically. A commissaire. He's been asking questions about Chez Moreau. You felt the cold more acutely. What kind of questions? About who goes there? About the back room? He was looking past you, not at you, which was correct for the street. He spoke to the man at the front counter yesterday. Did he say anything? The man at the counter is discreet. He said it was a private room for regulars, nothing unusual. Frederick paused. But he also said we should be careful about Tuesday evenings for a while. How long? He didn't say, until it passes. These things pass, usually. He looked at you then, briefly. I wanted you to know, you're newest. Newest people are most at risk from a change in pattern. You nodded. You understood. The newest person is the one who doesn't know yet what normal looks like, who might make a mistake out of ignorance that an older hand would not make out of habit. Thank you, you said. Don't thank me. He almost smiled. Just be careful. He walked away up Rue Saint-Jacques, and you watched him go, and then you went back inside and set type for the rest of the afternoon with your hands working automatically and your mind on the specific calculations of risk that had become, in 18 months, a kind of fluency you hadn't expected to develop. You did not go to Chez Moreau on the following 3 Tuesdays. You spent those evenings in the room on Rue de la Harpe, which was not as warm as the back room, but which was, for the moment, safer. Armand didn't ask why your Tuesday evenings had changed. He might have guessed. He said nothing, and you said nothing, and the room accommodated the new arrangement with the indifference of rooms. The commissioner's attention passed as Frederick had said it would. These things have rhythms. The city's attention moves. A different case emerges, a different concern. The mouches are redirected. You learn to read the rhythm if you live in the city long enough, not perfectly, not predictably, but well enough to make approximate assessments. In March, on a Tuesday, you went back to Chez Moreau. The same back room, the same wine. Robert the metalworker in his corner. Marcel the bookbinder reading by the candle. Sébastien returned from wherever the winter had taken him, looking slightly younger for it, or perhaps just less tired. Jean-Baptiste, he said when you sat down. Just that. Your name. Acknowledgement of continuity. Sébastien, you said. The wine came. The conversation began. The room was warm. Spring. This is what spring in Paris means when you've survived your first winter there. It means the morning air losing its hard edge, the cold releasing its grip on the stones of the city over a period of days rather than hours. So gradual you almost don't notice it happening until one Tuesday at the end of March you walk to Chez Moreau without your heavy coat for the first time since October and realise your shoulders aren't hunched against anything. The Seine rising with the snowmelt from the south, the river swollen and fast and brown, carrying the winter's debris downstream in great rushes of current. Driftwood and the occasional dead animal and other things you don't examine closely. The laundresses returning to their bateau lavoir with the air of people coming home, setting up their frames and their soap and beginning to pound the winter accumulation out of the city's clothes. The Tuileries garden in early April, the gravel paths re-emerging from the mud of winter, the first green appearing in the formal flower beds, the trees budding in a way that looks tentative from a distance and like eruption when you're close to it. You walked through the garden one Saturday afternoon in April, your first visit since October, your first visit since the conversation about the sweep last autumn that had made you redirect your walks through the city. The garden in April afternoon. The particular way the early spring light falls through the not yet leaf trees, making a lattice of shadow on the gravel. Other people walking, the usual mixture of everyone, families, students, the occasional person of obvious wealth accompanied by their retinue, ordinary working people taking the long way home because the day was good and the garden was free. And, yes, among the walkers, the particular quality of attention, the specific way some of the men moved, pausing, looking, the language you'd been learning for almost 2 years now, which you could read by now with something approaching fluency, though you were still learning the grammar. You walked through and did not stop and did not make eye contact with anyone in particular, and returned home on the long route via Rue de Rivoli and across the Pont Neuf with the river below you running its spring current. You were being careful. You were still being careful. But you were also now in the garden, which means something different from being careful in the room on Rue de la Harpe. You were in the place, present, visible to whoever knew how to look. The ice bear's weight. You've been testing it for 2 years and it has held imperfectly, with the occasional crack, but held. You're still here. The candle maker is not here. Those are both true. Both are part of what it costs and what it gives to be who you are in the city you're in. Guillaume found you in the garden that April afternoon. Or rather, you found each other, which is maybe the more accurate way to describe a thing that happened because you were both there and both looking, without prior arrangement, without explicit intention, just the city putting 2 people in the same place at the same moment in the way that a large city does constantly, which is also the way a large city makes things possible, that a small city cannot make possible, because a small city cannot hold the same thing invisible for as long. He fell into step beside you on the gravel path, the same way as July 2 years ago, the same natural falling into step, the same opening silence. You're here later than usual, he said. I've been careful. I know. A pause. I heard about the commissaire. Word travels. In the right circles. He was quiet for a moment. The sound of their feet on gravel. How are you? How are you? The most ordinary question. The one that in ordinary company means nothing particular. In this company, in this garden, in this spring afternoon that both of them had navigated a winter to arrive at, it meant something more specific. I'm well, you said. And then, after a moment, better than a year ago, better than I expected to be. The city does that, Guillaume said. It takes time, but it opens. You walk together for a while, not speaking, the garden doing what the garden does in April, which is exist as evidence that things that were frozen for months can become green again, which is not a metaphor so much as a fact, and the fact is sufficient. I have a friend, Guillaume said eventually. Someone I want you to meet, Not at Chez Moreau. Someone who lives on the Ile Saint-Louis. He's older. He's been in Paris 30 years. He knew the city when the gardens were different, when the police were different, before Berryer. He knows things that don't exist in writing. What kind of things? The kind that tell you what was here before the thing you see. The geography of it. How the places became places. How the language developed. Who built it? He paused. It's useful to understand where things come from. It makes the present less frightening. You thought about that. The version of Paris that runs underneath the visible one. The city that Sebastian described as having always existed. That Frederick navigated with his secretary's invisibility. That the men in the back room of Chez Moreau maintained on Tuesday evenings. Where it came from. What it looked like before it looked like this. Yes, you said, I'd like that. The garden on an April afternoon, the two of you walking, the city opening around you in the tentative way of spring, which is not quite committed to warmth yet, but is moving in that direction, which is enough. The man on the Ile Saint-Louis was named Augustin, and he was, as Guillaume said, old, perhaps 60, perhaps more, with white hair that had been red once and eyes that were still very much in the business of seeing things carefully. He lived alone in a small apartment above a clockmaker's shop, which meant his days were accompanied by the sound of mechanisms, the ticking and chiming of the clocks the clockmaker was always working on below, which Augustin had either made peace with or no longer heard. He received you on a Sunday afternoon in late April, in a room that was full of books. Not in the ostentatious way of a man who wants you to know he owns books, but in the practical way of a man who has spent decades accumulating the specific texts he wanted, and has run out of shelf space and is improvising with the floor. He made wine. The wine was better than Chez Moreau. He explained that he'd been buying from the same supplier in Burgundy for 20 years, a man who was now his contemporary in age if not in infirmity, and who sent 2 cases a year in recognition of their long acquaintance, and the fact that Augustine had once, in circumstances he declined to specify, done the supplier's family a significant service. He asked how long you'd been in Paris. You told him. He asked how you found it, and the question was clearly not asking about the streets. Frightening, you said, and then less frightening, and then occasionally frightening again. He nodded at this as if you'd given the correct answer. That's the right response, he said. People who lose the fear entirely are the ones who end up in trouble. The fear is useful. It's the instrument you use to measure the distance between you and the things that can hurt you. You need it calibrated correctly, which is to say, present, but not paralyzing. He looked at you over his wine cup. Guillaume tells me you came from Lyon, that you work in the book trades, that you've been navigating carefully. He paused. Have you been unhappy? The question surprised you, not because it was intrusive, but because it was so direct, so stripped of the usual indirections. Yes, you said, in the first year. Less so now. Good. Unhappiness is appropriate for the first year. It means you're paying attention. He settled back in his chair, which was old, and had the shape of someone who'd been sitting in it for a long time. Let me tell you something about this city, about what it was before you arrived. And he did. He talked for nearly 2 hours, with the occasional pause for wine or to locate a thought, or to look out the window at the Ile Saint-Louis street below, and what he said was this. Paris has always had this. He meant the garden, the bathhouses, the back rooms. He meant the geography of the hidden city. It didn't appear when he arrived 30 years ago. It didn't appear when his predecessor, a man he'd known briefly in the 1720s who'd been navigating it since the 1690s arrived. The history goes back further than that. It goes back to the medieval city, which had its own version. It goes back to the Roman city, which had a different version, but the same basic fact. People have always lived in the margins of the visible world, and those margins have always had their geography, their language, their economies, their losses. The police registration system, the thing that put names in registers, that sent mouches to the garden, this was relatively new, historically speaking. It dated in its current form to the late 17th century, to the lieutenants general of police who understood the city as something to be documented and controlled. Before that there was canon law, there was the secular criminal code, there were the courts. But the specific apparatus of surveillance and registration was new in the scheme of centuries, which meant it could also end. Everything changes, Augustin said. He was not saying this as comfort exactly, but as information. The registration system, the mouche, Berrier's approach, none of it is permanent. Cities change, governments change, even the laws change, though more slowly than the people enforcing them. He looked at you. In my lifetime, I've seen 3 different regimes of enforcement and 3 different geographies of the places. What you're navigating now is not what I navigated in the 1720s, and what someone your age will navigate in the 1780s will be different again. Different worse or different better, he considered this. I can't say for certain. I believe, better. The philosophes are doing something with their arguments, with their pushing at the foundations of things. Montesquieu, Voltaire, Diderot's encyclopedia is going to tell the whole world what it knows, and some of what it knows is inconvenient to old arrangements. He paused. Change is slow, but I've seen enough change in 60 years to believe it continues. The clockmaker's mechanisms below counted the hours in their staggered way, each clock at its own pace, the sounds overlapping. You're going to be here a long time, Augustin said. Not as a prediction, but as an assessment. You have the look of someone who's going to stay, which means you're going to learn things I can't teach you, because they haven't happened yet. He smiled. I hope they're the things I think they'll be. You stayed until the early evening. You walked back across the Ile Saint-Louis to the Quai de Bourbon, with the April evening falling over the river, and crossed to the Ile de la Cité, and then to the left bank via the Pont Saint-Michel, and walked home through streets that were familiar now in a way that was not automatic, that was earned. You knew these streets. You knew the 3rd step and the 7th step and the 14th. You knew which corner held the chestnut vendor in winter. You knew the pump in the courtyard and the damp that came through the east wall of the printing house. You knew the garden. You knew the back room on Tuesday evenings. You knew Sébastien and Marcel and Robert and Frederick and Guillaume and now Augustin, which means you knew something about what it was possible to know, about the kind of life that was being navigated here alongside and within the ordinary life of a compositor's apprentice on Rue Saint-Jacques. This is what surviving looks like in Paris in 1752 if you are who you are. It looks like the calibrated fear and the back room and the Tuesday evenings and the cold water in the basin every morning and the hot water in the bathhouse, once a month if you've saved enough. And it looks like the garden in April with the gravel path under your feet, and the spring light through the not quite leafed trees, and it looks like the letters home to Lyon that describe the printing house, and the food, and the city, in terms that are accurate and also edited, because some of the most important things about where you are cannot be sent in a letter, not yet, not in this city in this year. It looks like Armand saying, "Be careful," and meaning it kindly. It looks like Frederick coming to the printing house door on a February afternoon to warn you. It looks like Théophile, who is in the Bicêtre, and Augustin, who is in his chair above the clockmaker, and the space between them, which is the space you are learning to occupy. May. The city in May is the city at its most generous, before the heat and the stench of summer settle in, and before the cold of autumn returns. The morning air in May is almost clean. Almost. It still carries the city, but the city in May is carrying itself lightly, the way a person carries themselves on a good day when they feel all right, when the body is cooperating and the weather is cooperating, and the basic requirements are being met. You walk to the printing house in May through streets that smell of bread and river, and the green that is happening in the window boxes and the small gardens behind the larger buildings, and the tree in the courtyard that has leafed out completely now, its roots still lifting the paving stones, its canopy providing a small circle of shadow that the morning light has started reaching, and which will, by June, be the most pleasant spot in the courtyard. The almanacs are done. There are new commissions, a series of philosophical pamphlets for a publisher near the Palais Royal, texts that are being circulated carefully, in small editions, because some of what they say about the relationship between the natural and the moral and the legal is, in the terminology of 1752, seditious. Renaud takes these commissions with the same methodical care he takes all his work, making no comment on the content, setting the type as precisely as he sets the almanacs, producing the copies and sending them off to wherever they go. You set the type for a pamphlet about natural law and the distinction between what nature permits and what custom forbids. You read the text as you set it, because that's how compositing works, and you think about the argument it makes, which is that custom is not nature, that what society calls unnatural may simply be unusual, and that the category of unnatural has been used to enforce custom rather than describe reality. You set it letter by letter in the compositing stick and think about how you would make the argument differently, how you would make it more specific, more rooted in the actual lives of the people to whom it applies, and you understand that you can't say any of that you're a compositor setting type and not a philosopher writing pamphlets, but that the distinction between those two things is interesting and possibly not permanent. Maître Renaud looks at your work at the end of that week and makes his quality check and nods. Good registration, he says. The philosophical pamphlet especially. Some compositors rush the difficult words. You didn't. Thank you, monsieur. The difficult words. Yes, you did not rush them. The summer came, and with it the heat and the smell that the heat brings out of Paris, the exhalation of a city being warmed from above, all the things winter had crystallized becoming active again, the gutters running hot, the Seine low and working hard, the smell of the Rue de la Harpe in August returning to what it had been when you arrived, that first arriving smell of 14 months ago that now, familiar and undefended, you walked through without conscious awareness. You are a different person than you were when you arrived. Not entirely. You're still from Lyon. You still write letters home that describe the printing house and not the garden. You still wake up before Armand and go to the courtyard pump and wash your face in cold water that is startlingly cold. You still eat bread from the bakery on Rue de la Harpe, and soup from the traiteur at noon, and whatever Armand has managed for supper in the evenings. But you know things now. You know the geometry of the city that runs underneath the visible one. You know the grammar of the garden in the afternoon light. You know that the ice bears weight, imperfectly, with care, with the calibrated fear that keeps you from testing it recklessly. You know Sébastien and Marcel and Robert and Frederick and Guillaume and Augustine, and you know what those names mean in the particular ledger of your life in Paris, which is not the same ledger as the one Maître Renaud keeps for the printing house, but is a ledger nonetheless, tracking its own accounts, balancing its own columns. You're learning slowly what Frederick described, the middle place, the place between invisible and visible, the place where you can be who you are to the people who know how to see it, and be what the city needs you to be in the ordinary transactions of ordinary life, and where those two things do not destroy each other, but coexist, uneasily, with friction, with the occasional near miss, with the weight of what Théophile carries in the Bicêtre that you do not carry on Rue de la Harpe, and the particular gratitude of not carrying it, which is not exactly gratitude, which is something more specific than that, the awareness of contingency, the knowledge that what you have was not guaranteed. This is August again. 2 years since the garden in the late afternoon, the specific fall of light through the plane trees, the moment the dark room cracked open just slightly and you saw something through the crack. 2 years, 2 Augusts, 2 winters, 2 springs, 1 summer behind you and the current one doing what summers do in Paris, which is to press everything flat with heat and smell, and the particular exhaustion of a city that never stops. The Tuesday evenings continue. Sebastian has found new premises, more discreet, further from the inspector's attention, a room above a cloth merchant's on Rue des Archives. Same arrangement, same wine, same men mostly, with new additions and occasional absences and the general drift that any gathering has over time, people coming and going, the core staying constant. You have become, in the 2 years, something like a middle person in the room. Not new, not the oldest hand. You know the names and the stories well enough to help a new person navigate it, which is a position you arrived at without noticing you were arriving at it. There was a young man from Normandy who appeared in the spring, 21, working for a glazier on Rue Saint-Denis, who sat at the edge of the room with the look you recognised from your own first Tuesday, the look of someone for whom the ice question has not yet been resolved. Who is testing the weight of everything, including the chair he's sitting in? You sat across from him with your wine and said, "First time here?" He looked at you with the look. "It's all right," you said. "Nobody here wants anything from you except company." He didn't quite believe you, but he came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. His name was Philippe. He was, you gathered over several weeks of Tuesday evenings, the second son of a cloth merchant from Rouen, who had come to Paris to apprentice in the glazier's trade, and had, like you, found the city to be multiple cities, the visible one and the others. He was careful and quiet and observant, and he reminded you of yourself in the ways that were good and in the ways that cost something. The over-carefulness that Sebastien had described as becoming invisible to yourself, the maintaining of a distance that was starting to get in the way of actually being anywhere. "It gets easier," he told him one Tuesday, using the formula, which is true and also a compression of something more complicated. "How long?" he said. "Longer than you want, but it changes." He looked at you with young man's impatience at the adult's patience, which is the right response, really. The impatience of someone who has been careful long enough and can feel the careful becoming a room he's stuck in. You thought about what Augustin had said about change being slow but continuing. "There are men in this city," he told Philippe, "who've been here 30 years, 40 years, who've built entire lives here, who work at their trades and know the streets and have enough to eat and are, in the ways that matter, surviving." You paused. "The candle maker on Rue de la Verrerie, who was taken 2 years ago, He's also part of the story. Both of those things are true. You have to hold both of them. He sat with that for a moment, the candlelight making his face sharper than it was in daylight, the sound of the cloth merchant's building settling around the room. "How do you do it?" he said. "The holding." And you thought about it, about what it actually is, the thing you do to hold the risk and the possibility together without being paralyzed by the first or reckless about the second. And what you told him was this: you pay attention. You learn the rhythm of the city. You build the network slowly, the way you build anything that has to be strong, carefully with the right materials, testing each connection before you add the next one. You maintain your ordinary life with the same care, because the ordinary life is not just cover, it's also real, it's also you, and you have to not lose it in the managing of the other thing. You find the people who have survived longer than you, and you listen to them, not because they have all the answers, but because they have specific experience, which is the closest thing to answers this situation offers. You accept the fear. You calibrate it rather than try to eliminate it, because the fear is information, it's the instrument, and a miscalibrated instrument is more dangerous than a properly calibrated one. You test the ice repeatedly, and remember that testing doesn't guarantee it holds, but not testing guarantees you never cross anywhere. You grieve for the ones who don't make it across. Théophile and whoever else is in the registers, whoever else is in the Bicêtre or the galleys or the unmarked graves, you hold them in the same place as the people who have been here 30 years, and the fact that the first category exists does not diminish the second, and the fact that the second exists does not excuse the cost of the first. You live in Paris. That's what you do. You live in it. You live in the 8th story of it, where the air is thin and the view is wide and the fall is far. And you live there because the alternatives are the dark room with the furniture or the ground floor where you can't see anything. And neither of those is living exactly. You told Philippe some of this, not all of it. Some of it required Tuesday evenings to arrive at, required the particular quality of a back room in autumn, and the quality of wine that is cheap but present. He listened with the attention of someone for whom the listening costs something, which means it also gives something, which is what listening usually does. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," you said. "Just be careful, and come back next Tuesday." He did. The August heat bears down on the Rue de la Harpe from above and rises from the stones below, and the room on the 5th floor is hot enough to make thinking difficult and sleep a negotiation rather than a given. You and Armand have moved your pallets to opposite sides of the room in an attempt to distribute the body heat more evenly, which helps slightly. The basin of water you bring up in the evening you put your feet in before bed, which is the limit of what's possible. Maître Renaud closes the printing house on the feast days, and on the feast day of Saint Laurent in early August he closes for 2 days, during which you walk the city in the way you've learned to walk it, in the slow accumulating way that is both navigation and observation. You go to the garden on the 2nd day. You walk the paths in the afternoon heat, the shade of the plane trees now full and dense, the fountains running, the particular quality of the garden in summer, the crowd it holds, the range of the people in it, the ordinary city making use of the one space that is neither private nor commercial, that is simply there, as cities sometimes manage to have places that are simply there. You walk through. You notice what you notice. You keep your pace steady, not too slow, not too fast. You look at what needs to be looked at and away from what needs to be not looked at, with the fluency that 2 years have built. A man you haven't seen before sitting on a bench near the pond looks up as you pass. The look, the particular quality of seeing rather than glancing. You keep walking, but at the next bench, 20 feet further along, you stop, sit down, face the pond rather than the path, the way you do when you're watching the water and not anything else in particular. After a moment, a sound of gravel, footsteps, someone taking the bench at the far end of the bench you're on. Not the bench you're on, which would be too direct, but the bench beside it. The sound of a person settling, of a man taking the air on an August afternoon in the garden. A pause. "Good afternoon," he said. "Good afternoon," you said. The pond, the August light on it, silver and moving. A duck crossing in a straight line toward the fountain. Paris spread out beyond the garden walls, making its sounds, doing its business. This is the city. The beautiful one and the filthy one and the dangerous one and the invisible one and the one that exists in the spaces between all those descriptions, where the actual life happens. You're still here. After the winter, after the fear, after the calibration, after the letters home and the bread from the bakery and the cold water in the basin and the ink in the compositing stick and Maître Renaud's middle distance and Armand's Tuesday question. After all of it, you're still here, in the garden, in August, in a Paris that smells of everything it always smells of, and which you know now in a way that is not just navigation, but something more, something that doesn't have a simple word for it, in the French of 1752, or the French of any other year, really. You are becoming, in the imperfect way of a person in a city that contains everything, a person in a city that contains everything. You are learning the grammar of the hidden city the way you learn the grammar of the printing house, slowly, by doing, by making mistakes that are recoverable and avoiding mistakes that are not, by finding the people who've been doing it longer and listening to what they know. You are still afraid. That's good. The fear is calibrated correctly. It lives in you like the compass you use to find your way, pointing you toward the things you should approach carefully and away from the things you should avoid entirely, while leaving you enough room to actually move, to actually be in the city, which is the whole point, which is the whole enormous, difficult, ordinary point. The man at the other end of the bench says something else, something quiet, an observation about the duck on the pond, and you respond, and the conversation begins, which is just a conversation, which is also everything. This is August in Paris, in the year 1752, in a city of 800,000 souls, and 50 parishes, and 30,000 horses, and a river that carries everything, and a garden that exists in multiple cities at once. You're a compositor's apprentice from Lyon. You have ink in the creases of your hands that the pumice can't fully get out. You are becoming someone who belongs to this place, this city, this particular overlapping of geographies, visible and invisible, ordinary and hidden. The smell of rosemary in the hot water and the cold water in the morning basin, and the sound of the 3rd step and the 7th step and the 14th step on the way up. You're learning what the middle place feels like, and what you're finding slowly, year by year, is that it feels like being alive, which is not a small thing, which is in fact the whole thing, which is the entire point. The pond, the duck, the afternoon, the man at the end of the bench, the Paris that holds all of it simultaneously without requiring you to choose. You're tired, in the way of someone who has been working all day and will work again tomorrow, and the warmth of August is doing something to your eyes, the weight of the light becoming the weight of approaching evening. The city sounds softening as the day begins its long negotiation with the night. You think about the room on Rue de la Harpe, the 5th floor, the staircase that squeaks on the 3rd step and the 7th step and the 14th, the pallet that seemed uncomfortable when you arrived and now is simply where you sleep, which is what beds become when you sleep in them long enough. You think about the printing house in the morning, the smell of ink and oil, the weight of the compositing stick in your hand, the particular satisfaction of a page setting complete, the type locked in the frame, ready. You think about the Tuesday evenings and the men you've come to know in the way that people know each other when the knowing has cost something, which is the most durable kind of knowing. The August evening is coming on, the heat softening, the garden starting to empty as the families gather their things, and the students drift back toward the university, and the working people drift back toward whatever streets and rooms they come from. Time to go home. You rise from the bench. The man at the other end of it looks over, briefly, a nod. The small, precise currency of a specific kind of farewell. You nod back. You walk out of the garden and onto the street and into Paris, and the city takes you back the way it takes everyone back. Without ceremony, without comment, because 800,000 people are doing the same thing at the same time, and the city cannot afford to notice any one of them particularly. But you notice it. You notice the city, the specific weight of it around you, the smell and the sound and the stones under your feet. You notice the chestnut vendor on his usual corner, already setting up for the evening despite it still being summer, anticipating the season change in the way of experienced vendors. You notice the girl at the fountain on Rue de la Harpe filling her bucket, 3rd in line, waiting with the particular patience of someone who does this every day. You notice the tree in the courtyard through the gate, its canopy full in the August light, its roots lifting the stones. 3rd step, 7th step, 14th, the room, the window with its imperfect closing, the basin and the pitcher. Armand not back yet. The room empty in the particular way of a room that holds people who are temporarily elsewhere. You sit on the edge of your pallet and take your shoes off and your feet are grateful. The blister from the shoe that rubs has healed. You got the shoe mended in the spring, finally, took it to the cobbler on Rue de la Huchette, who looked at it with professional disapproval and fixed it in 20 minutes for a sou and a half. The room in the August evening, the sound of Paris below, doing what it always does, the sound that never completely stops, that you fall asleep inside of every night, the sound that has become, in 2 years, the sound of home. You lie back and look at the ceiling. Tomorrow, the printing house, the type, Renault's morning pronouncement, the paper from Périgueux, properly stored, not damp, the noon soup, the afternoon delivery, the smell of ink and lead that follows you home in your hands. Tuesday, the room on Rue des Archives, Sébastien and Marcel, the new young man from Normandy who is still learning the weight of the ice, the garden on a free afternoon when the light is right, the baths, once a month if you've saved enough, the rosemary in the water, the heat moving up through the body, the brief warmth of being entirely clean, the letters home to Lion, which describe what can be described, all of it, the whole complicated, warm, difficult, careful, alive thing. You're warm enough, fed enough, here enough. The evening light through the window changes as the sun descends, goes from gold to amber to the particular grey of Paris twilight, which is not quite darkness, but is beginning to negotiate with it, the way sleep negotiates with waking, the way one thing becomes another gradually, without announcement. The sounds of the city, the 3rd step and the 7th step and the 14th, which you can hear in your body even lying still, The body knowing the route it takes every day. The body becoming the city, becoming the body. Paris is doing what Paris always does, all 800,000 of it. The horses and the churches and the gutters and the Seine and the gardens and the bathhouses and the printing presses and the laundresses and the vidangeurs and the chestnut vendors and the mouches and the men in the back rooms on Tuesday evenings drinking wine that is cheap but present. And you are part of it. You are one of the 800,000. You are the compositor on the 5th floor who sets type with careful hands and walks through the garden with calibrated eyes and finds his way home through the dark city by the routes he has learned in the 2 years of learning this city. You're still here. That is not a small thing. That is right now everything. Your eyes are closing. The August warmth that is too much in the afternoon becomes, at this hour, with this tiredness, a different thing, something almost like comfort. The city heat that was the enemy all day becoming the blanket you didn't know you needed. The city breathes, the river carries. The bells will ring again in the morning, all 50 of them. The whole bronze conversation of Paris that begins the day, that has been beginning the day since before you were born. That will keep beginning the day after you're gone, marking out the hours of a city that contains everything, including you. Including this particular life you're learning to live in the only way it can be learned, which is from the inside. Good night.